Welcome back, everyone. We hope that you guys are all enjoying our deep dive as much as we are. Just want to do a special shout out to AMD for being our silver sponsor for our deep dives. Up now, we have Anita. She's going to be doing her talk on communicate to elevate, setting expectations and providing effective feedback. All right, the stage is now yours.
Thank you. Well, let's get things started immediately. No point delaying. So, just briefly, so you know who I am and why you should potentially maybe listen to what I'm talking about. I'm Anita. I have worked in the games industry for about 5.5 years. I've worked with a bunch of different indie studios, mostly in the size range from 5 to 15. The max I capped out was about 30. I've done freelance art direction and a bunch of generalist stuff, so I've been around the pipeline in different places since starting it. I initially started as a programmer and then moved over to art, so I've done the whole journey. Some of the productions I've been in, just briefly on screen, most of them are games, some of them are tools, and some of them are animation, as in linear animation, both 2D and 3D, and there's obviously a mountain of projects I can't show because they were either cancelled or under NDA, but just in case you're familiar with any of this, yeah, that's me. But honestly, to get to the meat of this talk and why you're actually here is communication, right? So my talk focuses on how to improve that. But first, we should probably know what actually is the impact of communication not working well on our team. And why, honestly, you should even care, because we're just here to make cool art and write code and then publish the wonderful thing we made, right? But if we look at statistics, and I have to preface this by saying that there's no objective measurements for measuring this. This is all based on surveys because we can only really go by what people feel. So take these with a bit of ambiguity, but they can give you some general tendencies. But if we look at it, about 86% of employees just generally think that ineffective communication is the bane of their existence and that it causes most of the issues in a company. And if you think back, I'm pretty sure you can empathize with the fact that most of the people you work with are generally competent at what they do, but most of the time when things go wrong, it happens in between because someone didn't have the vocabulary to express what they needed, or someone else just took it the wrong way. To put it with the words of my predecessor in the previous talk, we have different maps in our minds of the same thing, even while we're viewing the same thing. Even more striking, 97% of employees think communication impacts their task efficacy. So what this tells us is that almost all of your employees, all of your team members, freelancers, whatever your setup is, are aware of it when communication isn't up to snuff. And they'll be aware that it's affecting their productivity. So it's definitely an issue worth addressing. For about half of your employees, this is even more important because for them, it's a matter of trust. And if you think about it, that makes sense because if I give you a task and you come away, come back, you completed that task, and I reprimand you for not meeting my expectations, even though they, to you, weren't clearly voiced, that would erode trust quite effectively. So what's the impact if we actually improve communication? Once again, this is a survey, so these numbers are subjective, but people report about a 30% performance increase when you introduce measures to improve communication. This can be new tools, new techniques, training for staff, right? So communication either struggles with processes or with knowledge and soft skills. What we're going to be addressing in this talk is mostly the soft skills and training side for employees, because that's unfortunately often neglected in an indie context because there's not as much of a corporate structure around that. That's a benefit in a lot of other aspects in indie because there's not a lot of red tape, right? You're more agile and more able to do what you need to do faster as well. But in this context, it actually can be detrimental to development. The only kind of hard number we have on this is that if you look at what producers report, they say that they can save about 7.47 man hours per week an employee if they improve communication. This is also not a very precise number because they don't list what kind of improvement measures they did. But what it can tell you is that it actually has a measurable impact. Whether that impact for your company is that big or smaller, it will definitely still gain you more employee trust and an overall better mood on your team. Because there's nothing more irritating than not getting your point across or not feeling understood. So how do we fail at communicating? One example I could put down here is a very simple question that is often just asked in passing or very briefly at the end of a meeting, right, when you're standing around. In a remote context, this can be even more confusing because you might lose the other messages in the chain. But a very common phrasing is, can one of you get me this by tomorrow? Right? You're addressing the team, you're asking if one of them can get you whatever you're asking for by tomorrow. So what's the problem with this? The good thing about this is that it has a deadline. It's not a very precise deadline, but at least it gives you a day. Ideally, you would do something like end of day tomorrow by this time tomorrow. I have a meeting tomorrow, so I need it by then, right? But the main problem with this is that you're not clearly assigning a task to anyone. So no one knows who's taking responsibility for this. Like, who has to execute it is one thing, but who is responsible if it is not done? That's the more important matter. It also doesn't explicitly mention or recap the task you're trying to assign to them. So they might end up not exactly having an understanding of what you want and doing something kind of like what you wanted, especially if in that conversation you touched on multiple points. I'm going to go through a few examples here and then I'm going to show you some more concrete techniques. So the next one is, I need you to quickly whip up something for me. Let's sit down and sort it. And on paper, this is already better, right? So you're giving the person, especially if they're more junior, you're giving them support to do the thing you're asking for them. So there's potential to convey the information that's currently missing. So what's the problem with this then? We already established that it offers guidance and that is good. Especially if you're dealing with juniors or interns or anything like this, they will appreciate you taking the time to sit down with them. What it does not do is respect your team members' time. Because there's no, hey, what are you currently doing? Do you have time to tackle this now? There's just a top-down, hey, we're doing this now, right? If you're on the same hierarchy, like, so let's say you're equals in the workplace, let's put it this way, you will potentially create friction that way because you're telling them what to do. And if you're a leader, they will, if you do this constantly, start feeling like you don't appreciate their input or like you don't value their time. Interrupting tasks can also be a really big issue in creative industries because it takes a long time to get back into that mindset. It is already very hard to force yourself to be creative, but to have to force yourself to get back into a creative mindset after being interrupted takes quite a long time. I can't cite the source for this right now, but what I've read about is that it takes about 15 minutes for a human to refocus on a task when they were interrupted, and sometimes longer than that. So the more you interrupt someone, the more their productivity is going to plummet. Also, it doesn't tell them what the main task is that should be accomplished. So they can't make an educated decision on whether or not that task is more important or not than what they're currently doing. So even if they were confident enough to tell you, hey, I have something else going on, can we do this another time, that you wouldn't have the opportunity to do so because you didn't tell them how important the task was, what the task was, right? To continue this, we have another example of, I'll get this to you as soon as I'm able to. By the way, we still on for lunch today. This is different in that now we're getting into responses to requests, right? So you've just asked this person to do something and they've come back to you like this. What's wrong? Well, firstly, the good thing, it does confirm a task is being worked on. But it once again gives you no delivery time or an estimate as to when it would be delivered. It gives you no clarification what the deliverable they're referring to is. So they're just assuming that based on your previous conversation, you know exactly what they're talking about. And they will distract you with a secondary point. This is already a huge issue for neurotypical people in the workspace, but if you're working with a lot of neurodivergent people, which is pretty common in games, there's a chance they will latch onto the second part even more. So they might be even more distracted by stuff like this. So just to keep this in mind, let's say you got this answer and we're trying to make a mental note or even a physical note of what they wanted you to do, and then they hit you immediately with a different thought and that throws you out of what you were currently trying to do. So you're either going to have to ask them to reiterate what they want you to do after answering the second request, or it's just going to get lost. And then we have the external people on the team that we deal with, right? This is often a client, someone that's not in the creative field and doesn't know how to articulate what they need. From them, you'll get stuff like this. This doesn't look at all like what I asked for. It needs to be more exciting and fresh, which we don't necessarily need to pick this apart because it's just bad at every step, right? So we see that there's no actual actionable critique in here, and what is there is very vague. So this is pretty much a useless statement. And while people that are actually in the creative profession and work in games tend to talk like this less, it tends to still happen. So we just need to look out for that. So how do we do better? For short form communication, the best way to do it is to keep it as short and simple as possible, because no one has time to mentally go through a million checklists when they want to respond to someone. So what we do is similar to what you do when you call an emergency response line. We just use slightly different words out of the selection here. We tell them what needs doing, why it needs doing, and what immediately needs to happen now, like as they go away. So what is pretty straightforward, right? We definitely need to tell them what to do so they can do it. But what about the why? The reason that you need to tell them why is because oftentimes you're asking someone to do something for you because you have neither the expertise nor the time to do it, or at least one of those factors. So they need to know the context, the why, to make a better deliverable and to know how to organize their task. The next thing that's important, especially important the more junior they are, but definitely important at any level, is what they should do now. What is it exactly that you need them to do first? What is the first thing they take away from this? Their actionable point. This helps from going from I'm listening to you to I'm doing something. And it helps start the creation process rather than just leaving them here like this, where you're like, hey, I need you to create a table because we need one. And that would leave them kind of just looking at you and staring at you, kind of the way that people freeze up in emergencies, right? It's a much more harmless context, but it does gets the same response from people. So what would that look like in an example? Let's say we're trying to make a sound effect for when a building's construction finishes. Great, that's our what. Our why is we need to create some additional cues for the player so they can reallocate the workers faster. The current UI pop-up is not enough. In this case, you can see why the why is so important, because if I didn't provide the why, the building's construction finishing could be anything from just a hammer noise to a chair or something. But what's important for the sound designer in this case is to know what the purpose of that noise is, right? Because right now he now knows that it needs to draw the player's attention and that it needs to match the current UI pop-up. This is significantly going to increase the quality of your first revision just by giving that additional context. The what now gives them something to go on, right? So can you please give me a timeline for when to expect the first iteration so we can add it to the product backlog? For a general window, I have been told that we are hoping to have it in by the end of the month. This gives them something to do immediately, which is get started with the estimate. They're going to tell you exactly how long they think it will take. You can add it to the backlog, and then you can plan it for whatever sprint or whatever workflow you use whenever you want to pull that task. So what do we do for long form communication? Because here's where all the big checklists come in and where they're actually useful, because you can just hang it above your desk, have it as a desktop wallpaper, whatever floats your boat. But you can have it just somewhere where you can reference it whenever you write a long message, a brief, you assign a card, whenever it's relevant. This is the 7 C's is a technique that's pretty prominent in more corporate contexts, but I rarely ever see anyone that's aware of it in game dev, mostly because our context is very different. The first one we start with is clear. So if a message or a task is clear, that means that the goal or main point of the message is clearly communicated to the recipient. It tells them what actions need to be taken, and it leaves no room for speculation. To achieve this, we want to limit the length of the sentences, especially if you're talking to non-native speakers, because they will struggle with higher reading comprehension. The common misconception is that people that have worse reading comprehension are less intelligent, but that is honestly a pretty big misconception. All they struggle with is to understand the words you're using and the long structure. So switching to easier language based on your target group and who you're writing the brief for can significantly improve your communication with them. Another one that's really important is to stick to one idea feedback point per sentence. Because if you split up your bullet point by point, they can reference that back, right? So if you talk about the color changes needed on the asset and let's say the poly count change needed on the asset, in the same bullet point, it's going to start getting mixed up and some of it is going to get lost, as well as the original point being modeled. But if you split them up into separate points, they can reference those back separately and it will stay organized. Plus, you won't have to think about 2 different points at once while reading your paragraph. To stay concise means having as short as necessary a message and as long as necessary a message. That alone doesn't tell us much, but to get there, we have to get to the point immediately. Me being German, this is kind of imbued in my DNA. We actually catch a lot of flack internationally for doing exactly that. But what you should establish in your teams is that it's completely okay to do that. It is completely okay to get directly to the point without much of a preamble in a work context. In a social context, this can be very, very different based on culture, but in a work context, everyone benefits from immediately getting to the point, especially in an industry as fast-paced as game dev. Reading through how your cats are doing is great. when we're having a water cooler chat, but it's not as great when I'm trying to understand what needs to change about this asset. One thing you'll also encounter or even notice in yourself is that people lose a lot of filler words. If they're insecure, if they don't want to come off too strong, any of that can lead to people losing a lot of filler words. But they actually make it harder to read what you've written. It might take some of the sharpness out of it, but you're better advised to just change the wording entirely to take the sharpness out than to add those filler words. The last point, which should be self-explanatory, is to get rid of any superfluous or distracting points. So anything that doesn't further your effort or distracts from it should be excluded. This can also be stuff that's just not important enough to include because it might not be necessary for your MVP. Concrete, on the other hand, means that is as much detail as necessary, as little detail as necessary. This sounds a lot like concise, but it's slightly different in that it mostly refers to being more specific. So you want to use specific, precise phrasing. This means as long as your target audience understands it, using the correct terms, because it's faster than describing what you mean and more precise. This means instead of saying, get me a few of these things, you say, give me 5 of these things, using concrete metrics. And it also means using SMART goals. A lot of people that went through an academic career actually will be familiar with how SMART works, but a lot of other people will not. Which is why I'm going to quickly recap this later. But it is a framework that makes your goals very much more measurable and concrete for the person that you're giving those goals to, even if you're just doing them for yourself. Correct is another one that often gets dropped by the wayside, even though when you think about it, it should be obvious. Everything you do should be free of factual errors, of course, but you should also spend some time making it as free of grammar and spelling errors as you can. This does not mean that you need to be 100% proficient in the language. This means you're making the best effort you can in a reasonable time frame to make it readable and as correct as possible. It also means phrasing everything appropriately for your target group. I'm holding this talk now for adults and professionals. If I was holding this talk for teenagers or kids, it would be very different in phrasing. But also if I was talking to people outside of games, a lot of terminology would change and the examples would change, right? So keep that in mind whenever you're addressing someone. If they're more technically minded, if they're more into management, if they're more artistically minded. One really, really big pitfall that can really land you in hot water with people fast is spelling their names or titles or pronouns wrong. So make sure to check those and do a final read through. I know the way we evolved into writing text messages back and forth rapidly doesn't really make this intuitive, but that final read through will catch all of those, oh, I just accidentally sent something with a typo in it moments. And it will also make sure you don't accidentally write something that is a bit convoluted. Which brings us to our next point. Writing coherently means no rambling. It's something that happens a lot to us, especially in verbal communication, but some people tend to also start rambling in a written context. So they tend to let their mind wander and just start branching off into different things. This is fairly natural when it comes to spoken conversation, and so long as the person isn't adverse to occasionally just being told, hey, can we get back to the point? It's not an issue. In written communication, this isn't as easily rectified by your opposite, so you should look out for it yourself. It also kind of ties back into the no mixing of different issues. So you want your points cleanly separated. This helps a lot with this. If you're communicating via email, you also want to make sure that you're doing one issue, one email. Let's say I want to invite you to a meeting and I also want to give you feedback on something you've done. I would write 2 emails for that. The reason for that is if I send you one, you could delete one of them and lose the data for the other quite easily. Especially if I say the subject line is feedback asset X. So once you've implemented that feedback, you will delete that message, and then you will also have lost the link to that meeting. So make sure that it is a separate email and that it has a searchable subject line. So if you're inviting someone to a meeting, invite them to a meeting about the subject matter in the subject line, instead of just going meeting invite and no context. If you're assigning cards on like a card-based tracking system, like most people do with Jira, Trello, or Notion, you also want to make sure that you only have one brief on one card and it's one task. You can have subtasks and all that kind of stuff, but make sure that you're never splitting, that you never have 2 separate tasks on the same card that someone is trying to keep track of. The same thing is true for feedback. You want to do the per point structure, and you want to use the 3 Ws we talked about initially, and the feedback pyramid I'm going to mention later. Completeness is also important, mostly to reduce ineffectiveness and reduce time needed to communicate something clearly. So everything that the recipient needs to go away and do their thing, or to get back to you with an educated answer, should be included. To do this, you can look back at the 3 Ws if you're pressed for time, or use all of the 7 Cs here. But an easy way to think about it is to check if you could do the task that you're asking about with the info you're providing. Chances are this will help you get closer to completeness. If you're not very familiar with the subject, it can help asking someone that is. If you do not have that luxury, just do your best to include everything you think might be necessary. So they don't have to play email ping pong with you or write message back and forth across time zones to actually get to the point where they can start on the task. Because neither of you wants to spend 3 days clarifying a task instead of working on it. At the end of whatever message or brief you're giving, make sure that there's a concrete takeaway, a summary on action plan included. Even if it's a bullet point list of all the deliverables, anything is better than nothing. And the best thing to do is just give them something to start on, like we talked about in the examples. The last point is to be courteous. This is the most difficult one to nail because it differs from every company you're working in. Some are more casual, some are more corporate, some have a completely different culture you're immigrating into if you're moving for a job. But the main point is to always be friendly, open, and honest. That's the 3 things that will always remain the same no matter where you go. I'm speaking from my Western perspective here, and some of the steps below might change if you're in a different cultural setting. So keep that in mind and just ask if you're not familiar with what is appropriate in your workplace. So be honest, but check for hurtful and passive-aggressive or accusatory phrasing. Especially with text, the best thing to do is to go through from beginning to end and try to read it as someone that doesn't have a great day right now. Because chances are, especially if delivering negative news, they're not having a great day. So they're much more prone to interpreting what you're writing in a negative fashion. So if it can be, it will be. Just try to keep that in mind when you're looking at your own phrasing and how it is ambiguous one way or the other. One thing I found to work well as well is to make yourself seem less aloof when you're giving feedback, especially if you are the person doing it from top down in a hierarchy, is to bring your language down a level. Like if you tend to speak in a pretty posh fashion, try to reduce that and try to bring it down to a more casual level. Because even if you don't mean it that way, using that kind of vocabulary when you're giving someone negative feedback can make you look aloof. And lastly, you should always give the recipient of your message the benefit of the doubt in the first response. This means if you're reading something and it comes off wrong to you, chances are you're misunderstanding each other and they're not actually trying to insult you or dispute you. So that first response should always be courteous. You can always take the gloves off if an escalation is necessary, if they're actually being problematic, but that will happen across the multiple messages. It will never be the first one that determines that. So now that we've gone through all the 7 C's, I'm going to briefly recap SMART for those that aren't familiar. SMART is a framework for better goals and tracking, and it breaks down into specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Specific in this context for games means what needs to be accomplished, right? We talked about that in the first C. Who is responsible for managing and execution of the task? We talked about how it's often a problem that people think about who's responsible for executing a task, but not about who's responsible for managing the person executing the task or being responsible for that task being finished. If you're going into more corporate terms, who is the stakeholder, right? Who is important enough to need to be updated about everything? What steps are necessary to achieve it? And what are the milestones if the task is big enough to be broken down into some? Measurable means we want to be able to measure progress, right? And we need to determine what metrics we can use to do that. We also need to define what our definition of done is. When is the asset done? What is the threshold it needs to meet? And what are the concrete measurements we can use to define that? Because otherwise we can get caught in what a lot of game devs will be very familiar with, and that is an infinite improvement loop, where you just keep working on the same thing until it's perfect, but perfect doesn't exist, so you keep working. So the last thing we need to determine is how to track this progress reliably. To make something achievable means to give a second, means to make it actually realistic for that person to accomplish said task. So to do that, you want to get, if you can, and I didn't catch my own typo here, a second opinion on if a task is doable as planned. Which means if we can, we will use empirical data for our estimates. Which, for those of you that don't collect empirical data yet, start doing it, because the best thing to do is, let's say I want to create a 3D chair. I'm sorry, all of the examples are art-based, it's just my nature. I want to create a 3D chair, and I think it's going to take me 3 days to do it, with the restraints that I've been asked to do it with. It actually takes me 5. So the next time we need to make a similar prop, let's say a table, we will kind of know how much to estimate. And that will help you down the line because we'll get more and more precise the more data you aggregate. Especially because we ourselves tend to overestimate our own abilities, but others tend to be much better at giving us that feedback. If you're working on a team and you're not just a solo dev, you also want to look at reducing scope or increasing manpower to meet your demand. Is the task important enough to hire additional people to finish it, or to bring in another person from the team and pull them off another task? Or is the task an optional, or at least semi-optional task that we can just drop for now? This also plays into the next one, and that is every task has a priority, right? Most management systems assign an optional, an MVP, a high, a low, a mid priority, whatever system your team is using to prioritize tasks. It is always important to do that. And it's always important to make sure you only work on the most relevant tasks at the time. This also means considering if a task is time sensitive or if it can wait. If it is absolutely essential for the MVP, and if it has dependencies down the pipeline. It might be that something you're working on isn't that important in and of itself, but a very important task down the line really needs it to be finished. So the last one is time bound. And this is where we think about how often I need to update my stakeholder about this chair. Do I need to tell them every day, every second day, every week? Right? How often does it make sense to make sure to update people about my progress? And when do we think I'm going to hit the definition of done? And this is where you would set the deadline, right, for the task when the definition of done should be hit. If the task is big enough and we have milestones, we also want to make sure we define deadlines for those milestones. So now that we've finished recapping what SMART is, we want to talk about feedback. We've talked about briefs so far and giving people something to do, but now we want to talk about giving them a response when they come back to us with the result. The most important thing to do is to filter your initial reactions, because we all attach a lot of ourselves to our work. We care deeply about the games we make, and that means that we have visceral emotional reactions to something coming back that doesn't at all meet our expectations. Or vice versa, that really meets our expectations and makes us overly excited. One way to do this is to add a delay between the initial submission and your feedback. This is a lot easier to do if you have written feedback. So another way to do this is also to provide feedback in a written form. So it's the additional benefit of making sure that the person receiving the feedback can always refer back to it without having the pitfalls of memory to deal with or bad note-taking. But if you're sticking with verbal feedback, a good thing to do is to have people submit their stuff before you have the meeting where you give them feedback. So you can look at it beforehand in your own time and you have time to let those emotions settle. You can also use the frameworks I'm providing you with to build your argument on facts. You're still going to have all of your opinions in there. We're just trying to build it on data so we have something to point people to as concrete data. So in general, we want to do what we did with the briefs and to finish on an actionable plan. Right? We don't want to leave them sitting there feeling bad because you told them this and this and this and this doesn't work. You want to give them a concrete path to improvement. This doesn't mean you tell them what to do to fix it. This means you work with them on coming up with what the best course of action is. You don't want to rob them of their autonomy. You want to make them feel empowered to find a solution with you. Once again, you're also going to cater to your audience. Some people prefer to get their feedback extremely straight, and some really just want to be wrapped up in a cotton ball when they do that because they're so attached to their work. So this is another hard one to figure out, even though it's just a single bullet point on this slide, because people are so different in their requirements. It helps to have a sit down with them, but oftentimes people themselves don't know what they need in terms of feedback. So it's going to just be a bit of trial and error here with some of them. One that's criminally neglected is to use media references as much as possible. I recommend reading a few books if you're ever in a position to art direct specifically, and I can recommend some if people have questions about that. But even if you're not, if you're doing audio, even then, visual references can be great. Showing someone an image can give them a good understanding of what kind of mood you want. Using graphs, reference images, examples, sound bites, is not sheets and style rangefinders, as well as the more advanced stuff, can go a long way in making the person understand what you're looking for. And this is not just limited to art. There's a process called a cell sheet where you can try to make art that conveys the feeling of a game mechanic, right? That can help your designers and your programmers nail that feeling. But to do a good feedback pass, you don't just want to use all of those visual references, you want to build your argument from the ground up. Because if you just come in with opinions without data to back you up, most people, just like when you're talking about politics or any other fact in life, will dismiss you because it's just your beliefs. Why should I listen to you? Right? We're going back to the why. Especially if they have more experience than you, or if they have an equal amount, they're less inclined to just believe you on your word. And for reference, that's often a good thing. So what you want to do is you want to build a feedback pyramid. That means you aggregate a decent amount of data that subsidizes your beliefs, and then you follow up with your plan. What that means is that you will look at what they submitted and look at what is and is not good and what you can use to supplement your points. Let's say I don't like the wood that the person used on said chair. And I think another wood would fit better into the world we're building, or some different ornament. What I would do is I would look at the chair, see, and the reference that I provided for the task, and point out the areas where there's a mismatch. Then I would make sure I provide them with reference of what I think it should look like and references of the setting. So then I can build my belief on top of that, where I'm like, okay, so because this doesn't quite match and we wanted this in the concept, I think this material would fit better because in this reference, it also uses that material. Great. Now I've done the beliefs and data, but what's the plan now? So right now they just know I don't like the wood. So next thing to do would be to tell them, hey, if we already have that material, can you apply that in Substance Painter? Or can you try and see if you can find a similar material for us to use? If you want to create a custom one, you can ask them to go away and design it and make that material. Or if you are at the point where you just don't like the wood, but you don't know what you want instead, you can just use the data and say, hey, I think this isn't working as your belief, and then start the planning phase together, where you're like, okay, so I don't like this wood. I don't think it fits the setting. What do you think could work better? And then you'll just sit down and talk that out. Which brings me to the most important point, and that is that you always give your story, your problem, but you listen to their solution. They're the experts, right? And even if they're junior, even if they're young, they will have ideas. They will have something worth listening to. So instead of telling them exactly what to do, ask questions. Like I did in the previous example, what do you think would work here? Or if it's a more complicated technical thing, and you're trying to figure out a way to, I don't know, paint pink elephants on the UI, and you don't quite know how to do that, you would sit down with your programmer, right, and you would figure out which way is the most performant. Or you'd ask them, I want to do this, how would we do this? And what would be the drawbacks and benefits of each solution? Because oftentimes in games, you're working with highly specialized people, or people with at least very eclectic collections of knowledge in different fields. So everyone will have something worthwhile bringing to the table, no matter what you ask of them. Great. So this brings me to the end. We've covered a lot of different techniques. We've done the 3 Ws, we've done the 7 Cs, we've done the feedback pyramid, and you should now have a bunch of different techniques to refer back to if you need them and when you need them, to make sure that you can elevate your communication and make sure people don't feel like your expectations are unclear.
My camera's being all wonky. Great talk. Thank you so very much. We do have some questions. I'm going to pop your thing down and we'll get to the first one. So from YouTube, hey Anita, how do you calculate how long a task should be? How do you guesstimate for your artist if you have not experienced that particular task yet?
That's always a good question. The main point being, even if I haven't experienced it, chances are someone on the team will have. If and then you can go off of that. If you don't have that, you can try and figure out a similar task and kind of derive it off that. Sometimes you will just run into the issue that a task is completely alien, and then you just do your best to figure out how long it takes the first time around and use that as a measurement. Sometimes it's just really, really hard to estimate, so you just shoot for it. But most of the time, you can go to a similar task and extrapolate from there.
All right, let's pop up our next one. As the art director, how do you ensure that your team can come to you when they see issues or problems? How have you communicated a space for that to happen?
Okay, so this one is different depending on if you're working remote or on site. I mostly work remote, so this is actually a fairly difficult thing to do. The one thing that usually works is to provide a way to give anonymous feedback, because a lot of people are very hesitant to approach their direct superior or to approach someone that sounds like they have a powerful position, right? A lot of indie studios don't have really strict hierarchies, but it will still feel like it, especially with a direct issue with the person that's managing you. So the most effective way is to just set up an anonymous post box or something like that. If you can't do that, the second best way is to just, or rather you should do both, is to just make sure you keep communicating that you listen to them and establish that by precedent. If they come to you and say something, you have to always take it seriously. And if they don't come to you and say something, you have to regularly check in with them to build that feeling of trust that they can actually come to you. It's not just going to happen, it's going to need time. And over time, you can build that.
Awesome. So you had mentioned about trying not to distract and pull people off tasks and stuff like that. Coming from neurodivergent, it is always terrible when the person will email me or message me with like 15 different versions of stuff while I'm trying to fixate on something and get it done. It's gotten to the point now that when I have a task that I really have to do, I let the whole team know, like, hey, like, I need to get this done. I'll put up a little message being like, I have no willpower. Please don't interrupt me. Because once I'm off task, it doesn't take me 15 minutes to get back on. It'll take me 30, 45 to an hour to just get what I need to get back on. And when you're on a time crunch, you don't have that time to get refocused. So I thought that was great that you brought that up, because I don't think everyone's as mindful, because they're very focused on the here and now of what they need, that they don't think like, oh, but everybody else is part of this working cog and they're currently working on something as well.
Yes. So the main point we try to fix that at Sunscorch specifically is that we have a core hour block where we have all of our meetings. So all distraction is contained in this cube of like 3 to 4 hours a day, and everything else is your time to work on what you've been assigned. So if you don't respond to my messages outside of those hours, I'm not going to be cross with you. If you set yourself to do not disturb, that's just what it is.
Sometimes you have to keep the
Yeah.
wheel moving. You have to. All right. We have another question that came in.
Mm-hmm.
How can one become a better art director?
That one really depends on what you want to build. Being a better art director just means improving your skills and communicating. Because at the point where you become an art director, you have to obviously keep up with new techniques so you know what your artists are using, but it's less about your artistic skill. I would actually say a lot of the people that I work with are much better at the specific thing they do, right? They're much better at making environments if they're specialized in that than I am. But the main point is to be familiar with their workflows and other parts of the pipeline that it affects. That will make you have the hard skills to know what you're doing. And the other part is to build your soft skills and your ways to brief people. Because we talked about all the visual references. It can help to have a really good understanding of what tools you have at your disposal. There's a really good book about this called The Art of Direction, which I recommend to people because it gives a really good overview. It's by a art director that used to work with Marvel, and he also did a few video games. And he actually took the time to write it down because the one thing that's really hard with art direction is finding other resources. So the best choices you have is trying to find a good book or course, which is very hard to do, or getting a mentor. That's actually the best thing to do. If you have the option to talk to someone that's been doing this for a long time, I would recommend doing that.
All right, we have another question from YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any advice to communicate with people who simply don't seem to be reading carefully? I was reading about how we have this bad habit of constantly skimming nowadays. I'm guilty of this too. Me too.
Well, one thing that usually helps people that struggle with reading long flow text is condense what you're doing into bullet points. Shorter points, more poignant, right, will make it easier because even if they skim, they get the most important points. Depending on what that person prefers way of communicating is, you could also just brief them verbally and just have a brief written note for them to refer back to, right? If they don't read correctly and keep failing deliveries because of that, even if you're doing this to accommodate them, you might have to start actually enforcing certain measures for them to follow and start going the HR route of things. But before you do that, I would always try to accommodate their needs because often they will know what they need. You can ask them, would you prefer if we talk about this because it's easier for you to digest that way or because you can get additional clarification? Right? It always accommodate the person that you're working with so long as it doesn't detrimentally affect the rest of the team.
Awesome.
I hope that answers your question.
So, is the book by Ron
Yes.
Ashtian?
Yes,
Okay.
it is.
Awesome. See, easy.
It helped me a lot when I was first getting into art direction because I slid into it. I initially wanted to be a tech artist, and suddenly I kind of had a team. So it became a thing where I would just clamor through all the resources I could find. And I think 3 years in, I found that book. And he also has an ArtStation learning course, which gives you a really good overview. So I was already doing art direction for quite like 2 years at that point. But even then, looking into that book gave me a bunch of insights that I hadn't considered before and a bunch of techniques I'd never thought of before. So
Worth the read. We have another question. Can our art director contact you to talk shop or seek mentorship?
I mean, I'm not sure I'm the best to seek mentorship from because of my availability, but I'm always happy to talk shop.
All right. So we still have a few more minutes. If you guys have any last minute questions, get them in now. And just a reminder, this talk will be on our YouTube indefinitely. So you can always come back, revisit, especially you want to touch base on more things that Anita spoke about, and just come back, cycle through it again.
Yeah, I mean, I put my LinkedIn on there. If you do have a question that wasn't answered on stream, feel free to message me there. Just make sure to put like a subject line or something in there because LinkedIn is a cesspool of random requests nowadays. So if you put in there, I don't know, indie game business talk or something, I will actually respond to that.
And Anita is also in the Indie Game Business Discord.
Yes.
I can go ahead and pop that link into chat. As soon as I can grab it. So I am a incredibly blunt person, and my texting is blunt and my emails are blunt. And it's not something that like I purposely want to be blunt. It's just who I am.
Mhm.
So I have proofreading buddies that I literally will send stuff through to make sure that like my tone isn't coming off as harsh, or I can be scatterbrained and so can my texting. So that way I can know if it's in like a concise order. So I thought that was great that you brought that up as well about tone, because it's something I struggle with constantly and something I'm always mindful of.
Yes. So with feedback, it's slightly different than with briefs. With briefs, you always want to be immediately like very straight to the point. With feedback, it can be that you need to cushion it, so then you bring back some of the more softer phrasing, right? But it's always good to have someone proofread your messages, especially if it's a very sensitive context. Like if you're dealing with someone that's problematic on a team, you want someone else to read that. Because when I said that earlier about having a bad day and misreading messages, that's a very human thing and it happens to all of us. I think everyone can empathize with getting a text from someone that, when they read it back 3 days later, it was fairly innocent, but at the time they were like, oh, really?
Another thing to keep in mind is if you are working with neurodivergent people on your team, a lot of us have RSD, which is rejection sensitive dysphoria. So when we read a text that comes off very harsh to us, like we shut down. And it's not something that we can control. It's just an instant, I'm going to go in my shell. I'm going to sit and ruminate about all these things I've done wrong. So sometimes just really thinking about the person that you're addressing can be super beneficial, especially if they're neurodivergent.
It's especially important for that, but it's also important for most neurotypical people because we still have trauma contexts, right? Especially people that were bullied as a kid, which you get a lot of in game dev because escapism, right? They will be extremely rejection sensitive. They will feel very degraded really fast or insecure in their place in the team. That's not something you can fix as a leader. That's on the, like, you're not responsible for the trauma that was done to you, but you kind of need to deal with it, right? But you can try and make it as easy as possible for them.
Yeah. We don't know what everybody's lives are like. We don't know what's going on at home. You know, like we only see worker versions of those, you know, the people on your teams. You never know what they're dealing with. It's just nice to be mindful of stuff.
Yes.
But it is hard not to take stuff personally. It's very hard.
It's especially hard if you spend a lot of time on it. Like the longer the development of a game goes on in time, the harder it gets not to take stuff personally because you invested so much time in it.
Yeah, and it becomes your baby, you know? All right, that is it for us for your session. Anita, thank you so very much. You did amazing. So many great things I think all of us can benefit from and really grow from. So up next, we have Liana. She's going to be talking about making the most of your PR partnership through effective communication. So Dan will be back with that very shortly. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Anita, thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we'll see you guys.